All right, welcome back. This is part 2 of the chapter 12 video. I just took a look at part 1, and I don't know where my webcam went. I usually embed my picture in the video, and it wasn't there. I don't know if it's there now or not, but it doesn't really matter. You're probably sick of looking at me anyway. So we really only have 2 slides left here, so this should be fairly short, although both are kind of lengthy, important slides. So we had left off talking about how the Federal Reserve through the banking system creates money through that deposit multiplier. So you have the same chart in your study guide for week 5, the week 5 checklist. In this example, notice up top the reserve requirement is 15%. So banks are being required to keep 15% of their deposits on hand at the Fed. If you look down here, here's the multiplier. So 1 over the reserve requirement, 1 over 0.15 is, well, it's 6.67. When you multiply it times 100 million, you get 667 million. So anyway, the multiplier here is 6.67. So in this example, say we're in a recession, the Fed's Federal Open Market Committee decides it needs to increase the money supply and instructs the guy with the checkbook to buy bonds. So buying bonds is one of the ways the government can increase the money supply. We'll talk about that in the next slide, but this will walk you through it. So the Fed writes a $100 million check to Salomon Brothers to buy treasury bills, which are bonds. Now, Salomon Brothers has $100 million more in cash, $100 million less in bonds. That's how you've increased the money supply, because you can't spend a bond, but they can spend the cash. Salomon Brothers takes that $100 million, puts it into their account with Citibank. Citibank has to hold $15 million due to the reserve requirement, but then it has another $85 million that it can loan out. So let's say it loans $85 million to USX Steel. Now USX Steel has more cash. They go out and buy a bunch of stuff, or even if they don't, they deposit it in the bank. Either they deposit it in their bank or they buy something from somebody else. That business deposits it in their bank. Either way, that $85 million ends up in a bank somewhere. We'll call it Mellon Bank. They got to keep 15% of that on reserve. That's 13 million. That leaves another 72 that Mellon Bank can now loan out. So in this case, it says they loaned it to the city of Boston for road construction, right? So we loaned $72 million to Boston. They then go out and spend that, hiring workers and buying equipment, things like that, doing road construction. All that money that they spend ends up being deposited into a bank somewhere. 15% of it gets held on to, 85% gets loaned out again. So that's the idea. This process just continues over and over again with that money kind of being spent and respent, but just a little bit smaller every time. But mathematically, the multiplier tells us how much of an effect that has. So the point in this example is this initial $100 injection from the Fed turns into 667 million total impact on the money supply. So when the government exercises monetary policy in order to try to speed up or slow down the economy, they know what this multiplier is, and they have to take account of that to know how much money to put into the economy to get a certain desired effect. So the Federal Reserve Bank, Federal Reserve System has many roles, which you'll read about in the chapter, but its real main, most important role is to exercise monetary policy, which is influencing the size of the money supply for the sake of managing the economy, making sure we don't have too much inflation or too much unemployment. They have 3 tools for controlling the money supply. So one we've talked about the most so far is that reserve requirement for banks. They can increase the reserve requirement. That means banks have less money to spend, so there's going to be less money out of the money supply. Or they can lower the reserve requirement. That means banks have more money to loan. Sorry, I said spend before. Lowering the reserve requirement gives banks more money to loan out, and that increases the money supply. The discount rate, a lot of people think the Fed controls interest rates. Indirectly they do, but only indirectly. The discount rate is a specific rate that the Federal Reserve charges for overnight loans to banks. So for example, if a bank doesn't have enough money on hand to meet its reserve requirement, it might then go borrow that extra money from the Fed, and then it has to pay it back. So the discount rate is that particular interest rate. Banks can also borrow money from each other, and they set their own interest rates. But the truth is, all these rates kind of tend to move together because they're sort of substitutes for each other. So if the Fed wants to lower the discount rate, more than likely other interest rates are going to come down as well. That encourages more spending and lending, that sort of thing. So lowering the discount rate will increase the money supply. Raising the discount rate will decrease it. And then last, the fancy term for this is open market operations, but really this is the buying and selling of government bonds. So, and just this is conducted by one particular part of the Fed called the Federal Open Market Committee. Again, there's more detail in the chapter about the various parts of the Fed. I don't really care that you know all of them, but you should at least, I think, know who the Federal Open Market Committee is and what they do. They're the ones that are in charge of determining the buying and selling of bonds. So this is another part of monetary policy. It takes a little bit of thinking, but if the government buys bonds, that means people are holding on to bonds, and the government says, hey, we want to buy that back from you before its maturity date. A bond is something that a person can't readily spend, so it's not part of the money supply. So if the Fed goes and buys a bond, they give you cash, they take the bond, now you have cash, which presumably you're going to put some in your checking account, you're going to spend some. So a portion of that becomes part of the money supply. If the government sells bonds, they're basically selling you a financial good that you're going to hold on to for a while, but you can't spend. So they're going to sell that to you, and they're going to take money out of your checking account. So selling bonds decreases the money supply. So those are the three key tools. That's really all you need to know about monetary policy. If you can understand these three things and how they work, that's key. These are the three ways that the Federal Reserve, the government, through the Federal Reserve, controls and influences the money supply. So that's one way of affecting the economy. There's also fiscal policy, which we'll talk about next week. But if you can understand these for now, that's great. All right, as always, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.